would like to welcome you to A Matter of Law, a monthly podcast created by the Law Firm Network, where highly acknowledged and specialized lawyers from across the world discuss the future of legal international topics such as COVID-19 regulations, corporate insolvency and restructuring, real estate post-COVID, regulatory issues on IT and emerging technologies, and many others. I am Rafael Truan Blanco, Executive Director of the Law Firm Network, and today we will be speaking about the impact of COVID in the retail industry. We have around the table some of the members of our Insolvency and Restructuring Practice Group who will discuss this issue under the heading Boom or Bust in the Retail Sector, COVID Perspectives for some of our European members. Here with me is co-chair of the Insolvency and Restructuring Group, Mónica Lorenzo Pérez. Mónica is a partner in Brown Rudnick Bankruptcy and Corporate Restructuring Practice Group. Mónica's practice includes cross-border situations across a variety of sectors, including project finance, retail, infrastructure, energy, and natural resources in both distressed and non-distressed scenarios. Also here with us is co-chair Peter Krarup, a partner at Mazanti-Andersen in Denmark. Peter has been involved since 1992 in a large number of compulsory dissolution proceedings and bankruptcies, and has participated in several company restructuring, including most recently one of the largest bankruptcies in retail in Denmark. Finally, Mark Homan, partner at BHSM Ireland, where he heads up the Insolvency and Corporate Restructuring Department and leads a team in the Litigation and Dispute Resolution Department. Mark specializes in advising liquidators, receiver, examiners, companies, and lending institutions in all aspects of corporate restructuring and insolvency matters. The Law Firm Network is a non-exclusive association of independent law firms with presence in more than 50 countries around the world who share legal knowledge and expertise. And this is what we would like to share with you today too. Our insights and points of views on how we see the market, and our comments on issues such as the status of the retail industry in a number of countries, government support in the face of the pandemic, financial support packages, restrictions on winding apps, forfeiture of leases, and finally, a forecast. What does the future hold, and if this is the end of the retail as we know it? I hope you enjoy it. And perhaps, Mónica, you can introduce the topic, and it's over to you now.
Over the past year, the world has faced an extraordinary crisis. The COVID pandemic has sent shockwaves throughout the globe, and no sector has been unaffected. This has been particularly true in the retail sector, where bricks and mortar retail were already engaged in a battle for survival against the online players. Now, with the additional challenges added by COVID, we expect that the retailers that emerge from this pandemic will look very different to what we had before. And the idea of a return to normal cannot be an expectation of that sector. So today we're going to be discussing the perspectives and experiences of three different markets, but we cannot look ahead without knowing where we are now. So on to our first question for the day. Peter, how is the retail industry faring in Denmark, and what impact has COVID had on it?
Well, I think Denmark reacted to the COVID-19 in the same way than a lot of other jurisdictions did as well, that they closed down a lot of the industry, the retail, restaurants, fitness centers and everything. And the same happened in Denmark in March and April 2020, where Denmark was closed. And then they reopened in May. The malls were closed for a bit longer because they wanted to prevent too many people to be together. And then again, just before Christmas, they closed down everything again. And the retail industry has been closed down until actually the beginning of March. So we have had, severe impact on the retail industry, with a close down of at least 4 to 5 months, up to 6 months for several of them, and of course that has made an impact on their earnings in this industry. We faced the biggest decline in retail sales in 20 years in March-April 2020. At the same time, there was a 20% increase in the internet commerce. So people were still shopping, they just did it another way. And I think this is something that we will be returning back to in some of the later things we were going to discuss. So they had very difficult times in the retail industry. There have been a lot of support aid packages to try to assist these companies, but they have not been that effective as they could have. The special problem for the retail industry, as I see it, is especially something like the clothing industry. They had this problem that they lost the sale for the pre-summer. And they were sitting on a lot of stock, which they could not sell at normal prices like they normally do. And they faced the same problem again in the winter sale because they were forced to shut down again. So a lot of the clothing industry is really, really hurt because their stock has really diminished in value. And it will be really, really tough for them to get out of this financial situation, especially when they have to pay all the suppliers of these goods. The other part for the clothing industry is that normally they make their orders 6 to 8 months in advance. So they had to guess which impact the COVID will have in the future. So I also think that they have made, less orders than normal. And that, of course, will also affect their financial situation in the next coming 6 months or something like that. But something like the supermarkets and grocery stores have, of course, had a lot of success because they were not closed. They were kept open for people to be able to buy normal supplies, food and this kind of stuff. But a lot of the big ones also have non-food departments, and they, of course, had a very large increase in turnover because they were able to sell computers, televisions, bicycles, and something like other shops were prohibited from doing. So yeah, it has been a tough year for the retail industry. I was appointed receiver in the first large COVID-19 bankruptcy in Denmark. It was in end of April last year, 2020. It was the oldest book chain of bookshops in Denmark. It was founded in 1896. So it was 124 years old, very well known in Denmark, and it went bankrupt. Of course, they could see that the future was not as bright for a physical bookshops as it had been. But I think that the COVID and the closing of all the bookshops really was the end of what they could manage. So they went bankrupt. At least we managed to save 18 out of 30 shops and 250 employees out of 450 employees by selling off 18 of the shops to some competitors who still believed in the case. Around half of the shops had to close. But to end what the situation in Denmark is that at the moment, besides this and a few others, we haven't really yet seen so many COVID-19 caused bankruptcy yet in the retail sector. They have managed to keep on. They have been closed, a lot of them, and probably survived partly by loans and extensions of payments and aid packages. But I think when they start to open, it will be another issue when people start to demand payment of the creditors when they come to collect what they are still owed. So yes, this is the picture seen from Denmark.
Peter, Mark Homan here, and I think it's fair to say that the situation in Denmark is very much mirrored here in Ireland. Put simply, I think COVID has been devastating for the retail sector in Ireland, and much like Denmark, we've been in a period of lockdown, either full lockdown or quasi-lockdown. since March of last year. And I think it's fair to say that the retail sector has been affected more than really any other sector in the Irish commerce. Some businesses have been able to remain open. So essential businesses, those serving food and drink, certainly in a retail setting. But anything apart from that, really, any non-essential business has been forced to physically shut their stores, which leaves them only in a position to provide service by online or through click and collect. And even now in Ireland, click and collect is not allowed under the current range of restrictions. I think the true impact of lockdown, in fact, has been artificially masked by government support. And I don't think any of us have really seen the impact yet. As an example, our firm was engaged at a fairly early stage in restrictions last year by the Mothercare Group to advise on the winding up of its operation in Ireland. And it had a very considerable operation with multiple stores spanning the country. And we felt that really would signify the onset of an avalanche of retail insolvencies. And whilst there has been a number of retail insolvencies and high-profile ones at that since, there hasn't really been anything along the lines of the volume we predicted at the outset. And in fact, almost unbelievably, corporate insolvencies generally are 11% down on 2019. So corporate insolvencies for 2020 are actually down on 2019, which is almost impossible to believe. And the reason for this is because of the government support, and because I think the sympathetic or practical outlook that's been adopted by creditors. So in terms of landlords, for example, in terms of their banks, and also in terms of the revenue commissioners. The revenue commissioners in Ireland, for example, have allowed individuals and businesses to warehouse debt. So that's allowed businesses to continue. I think in addition to that, one of the trends that we've seen is the nature of the retail stores that have gone into liquidation, and a lot of them are cross-jurisdictional enterprises, and a lot of them, as you say, Peter, are in the clothing sector. So, for example, some of the retail casualties over the last year are household names. To list just a few: Debenhams, Laura Ashley, Monsoon Accessories, Topshop, Oasis, Warehouse, Pamela Scott. I don't think anybody would have thought, even with the onset of online shopping, that any of those names or all of those names would feature in the casualty list of corporate insolvencies. One other trend we've seen in Ireland is the use by companies, utilization of companies of the examinership process in Ireland, which is a corporate rescue mechanism. And that, I suppose, the most notable applicant in that regard last year was New Look, which was a multinational retail clothing chain. And in fact, that application was unsuccessful. And it was quite notable that the landlords in that case took a view that the company, it wasn't an appropriate case where an examiner ought to be appointed to rescue a company. So in summation, I think it's fair to say that retail has been affected really more than most. And I think later on in the podcast, we'll get into further detail as to what the future holds for retail. But certainly, I think the scene at the moment is rather artificial, arising out of the government supports and other supports that are and other sort of and the leniency that's been shown to by creditors just in terms of restrictions on lockdown.
Things are very similar here in England and Wales, as you know, described by Peter and Mark. There has been some form of lockdown since March 2020, coming up to the 1-year anniversary of that. Not something I feel anyone wants to be celebrating. All non-essential physical stores were closed overnight and have been only opened throughout the last year for a period of maybe 3 or 4 months. There was a surge in online shopping, and it was those retailers who were able to, who either had a strong online presence already or were able to adapt their to online quite quickly, who managed to, I'd say, not thrive in the last year, but managed to battle through the last year successfully. I think Next and John Lewis have said that their online sales have nearly made up for the loss of in-store sales, which is always a good sign for them. But again, then today we're on the 11th of March, John Lewis announced that they had a full year loss of £517 million. I agree with Mark, though. We haven't seen the kind of insolvencies that everyone was predicting March of last year, where everyone expected to be incredibly busy. And that is because of the government support measures that have been put in place. There have been big name collapses, most recently the Arcadia Group. But in those cases, in other retailers that have gone into administration or had pre-packs, these were companies that were battling, had not properly adapted to what their consumers or customers were looking for at that time. And COVID just exacerbated those problems and forced them to deal with them probably sooner and not very successfully. Interestingly, though, there was still a market for the brands. Arcadia's brands, Topshop, probably the most popular one or known one, was bought by ASOS together with a number of them. And where the retailers have gone into insolvency over the last year, brands have been bought. But unsurprisingly, there's very little market for physical stores. Investors or purchasers are not looking to buy the physical stores. They are just adding the brands to a already strong online presence. I agree with Peter around a real struggle that has been faced by non-essential retail, especially in the clothing area, is the purchasing of stock. One, they were stuck with stock that went out of fashion or the seasons changed, and then they were trying to plan what kind of purchases they were going to make for the next 6 to 18 months. And at the same time, a lot of suppliers turned around and needed cash in advance or cash at the point of ordering because everyone was very concerned around liquidity during the crisis. So they've had a really tough time, but we've just not seen the collapses that we would have expected to see because of the government support measures. So I think the short answer is that UK retail has been in trouble for a number of years. COVID has just accelerated these problems.
Well, to follow up on that, Monica, well, I guess most of our governments have tried to support the pandemic by, well, both financial and legal measures. So could you just continue and just explain what have been done in the UK from the government side to from financial support packages?
Of course, I suppose I hate using this word because it's probably the most overused word of 2020 and 2021, but the government support packages have been unprecedented. On the financial side, we have had the furlough scheme in place since probably March, April last year, and that has been recently extended again to the end of September. The government made a raft of government loans available to businesses of all sizes, and the last reported figures show that the cumulative value of the coronavirus business interruption loan, the large business interruption loan, and the bounce back loans is something in excess of £70 billion. There's also been the VAT relief and the business rate relief, which is always a very touchy and often troublesome subject for tenants, has all been extended to the end of September. So the government has done more to support business than I think anyone would ever have thought quite possible. The big question is what happens next when that financial support is withdrawn and loans, these 70 billion loans, need to be repaid by borrowers. Mark, how has the Irish government responded financially on the financial side?
Well, again, the situation in the UK is very much replicated in Ireland, and I really think it's fair to say that the Irish government cannot be faulted in terms of the fiscal support they've given to businesses and indeed individuals throughout the whole crisis. And of course, there's a lot of economic sense in that, and as it happens, as it happens, the Irish economy fared remarkably well. There was modest growth in the Irish economy for 2020, which again is almost impossible to believe. Having said that, the investment in support for COVID, in respect to COVID, has been massive and beyond comparison in terms of anything else in the state. And so that growth will be necessary. And I think the investment is made on the basis that if jobs can be maintained and as many businesses can be maintained and survive as possible, well, then the journey out of the trough that is COVID and economic restrictions will be that bit easier. The thrust of the support from the Irish government has really been to maintain jobs, and everything that is the entire focus in terms of the stimulus provided. The stimulus has been rolling. It has adapted along in tandem with the various levels of restrictions that we've been going through over the last 12 months. And currently in place in respect to businesses is a COVID restriction support scheme, which is subject to a €5,000 weekly maximum payment for businesses who are simply unable to operate. So the government is directly supporting those businesses that cannot physically operate because of the restrictions. In addition to that, there have been wage support schemes, and there's been a number of incarnations of that. But the thrust again is to support those who are out of job, out of work, and really the thrust has been to lean on companies to hold on to people, and so as to avoid a mass redundancy situation. In addition to that, like the UK, there's various loans and grants being provided to companies, and local councils are waiving commercial rates. And also, and very importantly, the revenue commissioners have allowed taxes to be warehoused both at individual and corporate level. And that is allowing companies really unprecedented scope to work their way out of their difficulties. Some of them have avoided a cash pinch by deferring their tax obligations, and that's allowed them to stay afloat in many instances. So that's the situation with regards to Ireland. Peter, you might let us know what supports the Danish government are providing.
Well, at the point where we faced COVID-19, we actually had a pandemic legislation already in force in Denmark. And according to that, which were, I think, more than 100 years old, a business was entitled to 100% damage or compensation if they were forced closed by the government due to a pandemic. But I think that the government quite fast calculated the consequences of that. So that was changed instantly to a scheme with 8 packages, which were not providing 100% compensation, but only less. I think the Danish government help packages has been divided into 2 tracks. One is to providing liquidity, primarily by postponing taxes, VAT payments, and so on, and also providing certain loans to be available. But basically, that any tax payments and VAT payments has been postponed for a period. Of course, that is not. It's only helping at the present because, like you said, things has to be repaid at some point, and you need to make the money before you are able to do that. And that will not be something which can be expected in the near future, as I see it. The second track is compensations, 8 packages, and they have provided several of those. One for salary compensation, where the businesses will get between 60 to 100% compensation of the salaries if they send their employees home and refrain from firing them. So to try to keep the employees still in place. Then they had a compensation scheme for self-employed, small companies with only one person, the craftsmen and hairdressers and something like that. then they added a compensation for fixed costs, because one thing is to be compensated for the salaries, but you still have to pay your rent and other expenses, even though that you are not opening or your business is not open or only partly opened. And they made a special compensation for cancellation of major events, festivals, theaters, and musicals and something like that, because that was also very heavily hit by the lockdown. Basically, this compensation has been okay, but of course, for some companies, the criteria to get them was a bit difficult, and also some of them needed that you had the application signed by your accountant, so it was expensive, it took time. And still, if you only compensated 60% of the salaries and only partly for fixed costs, there's only for some time that you can survive, because you will still have a loss every single month with no income. So that is the problem. But the biggest problem was that the payments of these 8 compensation has been delayed a lot, and a lot of companies have not even received it yet. So it doesn't really make it easy to try to survive on an 8 package if you don't get the money. And personally, I have helped a lot of companies to fight off bankruptcy petitions because they did not get, for instance, the salary compensation, but still had to pay the wages, and the unions just filed for bankruptcy if they didn't get it. So well, it has been tough for a lot of companies, also because the money wasn't paid as you were supposed to, or you believed you will have them. So this is the situation from Denmark from that perspective. In Denmark, we also, and also I think in your jurisdictions, we also have seen some changes in the restructuring insolvency legislation. So Mark, have you had any changes in your insolvency legislation to cope with all these potential new insolvent business?
Well, Peter, we have. In some ways, it's been relatively limited. And I think in fairness to the government, the Irish government, and indeed any other government faced with this unprecedented crisis, everything was very fluid. And some of the stimuli, for example, that the Irish government rolled out at the very beginning was, imperfect. Some of the wage subsidy schemes were imperfect, but they were a means to an end at the time. And it was better to have something really than nothing at all. So in that context, the government haven't really focused on rolling out detailed and very prescribed legislation in order to deal with the unfolding issue, albeit some emergency legislation has been enacted in order to deal with a couple of bespoke issues concerning really corporate insolvency law and corporate governance. And a couple of the highlights there, I think, is for a few of the hacks out there, the Companies Miscellaneous Provisions COVID-19 Act 2020 has dealt with a few of those issues. And I suppose a couple of the highlights would be the extension from 100 days to 150 days protection for our corporate rescue mechanism, which is examinership in Ireland. So that provides companies with additional time in order to formulate a rescue plan or a scheme of arrangement. Secondly, the ability, the requirement to go by a creditor to go to court to have a company wind up on the basis of it being insolvent, that minimum threshold has been extended or raised, I should say, from €20,000 to €50,000. And as I say, there's been a general trend in any event by creditors to allow companies a little more wriggle room in order to get out of their difficulties. One of the areas, of course, we've seen come under very significant pressure, and we're speaking about today, is retail, and high street retail obviously involves property, and we have tenants and landlord relationships. And whilst there has been legislation enacted to protect the private tenant in Ireland, there has been no such legislation enacted to protect the commercial tenant, and that is still seen by the government as a commercial contract between landlord and tenant. And I think there's an understandable reluctance to interfere with that. There has been a code of practice released, which strives to implore landlords to engage with their tenants with the view to either dealing with arrears or allowing some forbearance for a tenant who simply isn't trading and isn't in a position to pay rent. So there are some legislative protections there for tenants. They would be very much on the minimum side, I would have thought. But notwithstanding that, landlords are taking a view in relation to leases, because ultimately, if a landlord moves to retake a premises, for example, there isn't a great market to lease that premises on again. So whilst there are not legislative protections there for tenants, the reality of the fact is that most landlords are engaging with them nevertheless. Monica, you might let us know what the situation is in the UK with regards to any legislation changes.
So there have been quite sweeping legislative changes, or at least insolvency legislative changes in England and Wales, because what every lawyer wants in the midst of, getting used to working from home in the middle of a pandemic is a whole new insolvency law to get your head around. But that's what the government gave us in June of 2020, the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act, or CIGA, as it has now become known. And that was made up of really two parts: temporary measures that were put into place to deal with the effects of COVID on business, and then some permanent solutions that had been consulted on by the Insolvency Service several years ago. So on the temporary measures, there's a lot of what's been mentioned by both yourself and Peter previously, which is around there's a temporary restriction on the ability of creditors to present winding up petitions for unpaid debts, unless it can be shown that the non-payment of the debt is not related in any way to COVID, which is pretty difficult at this stage. There has been a relaxation on wrongful trading regulations for directors. And interestingly, on the landlord-tenant, which I'm interested to hear what the situation is in Ireland. In England and Wales, the ability of a landlord to terminate a lease for non-payment of rent, so forfeiture of a lease, has been restricted. So landlords don't have that option available to them, which is going to be interesting when we see the relaxation or withdrawal of the government support measures, because you've got some tenants who haven't paid their rent if they paid by quarter from December 2019. It also causes huge frustration in the landlord community, because there are some tenants who can pay their rent. They're just not paying their rent at the moment. Was it Hammerson who reported earlier this year that they've only collected a quarter of rent due for March? So the knock-on effect has been terrible from the tenants to the landlords, and to those landlords, investors and lenders. But we also have some new permanent insolvency changes: the introduction of a standalone moratorium procedure for companies experiencing financial difficulty, and a new restructuring plan, which is very alike a scheme of arrangement, but with the added benefit of being able to cram down dissenting creditors if certain conditions are met. So that has now been used, I think, 3 times since it was introduced in June, most notably for Virgin Airlines, though there was no cram down there. So all change in the insolvency world in England and Wales. It will be interesting to see how these tools are used over the next few years. Peter, what are things like in Denmark?
Well, at the moment, no real changes have been made to the Danish Bankruptcy Act. And also the bankruptcy court has continued doing business as usual. But it seems some of the creditors have been more patient filing for bankruptcy. So everything has been working normally. The only thing that has happened lately is that the Danish government have submitted a bill to try to simplify the restructuring process in the Danish Bankruptcy Act. It haven't passed yet, but is due to be considered and passed in the Danish Parliament here in March 2021. I don't think it will make that huge of a change. We didn't, the previous restructuring act did not really work well. So they have tried to change some of that. Especially, it was mandatory to have a trusted accountant, which increased the cost for a restructuring process. And also a very significant one. It was like this, that if you filed for restructuring and you didn't manage to have the creditors to vote for that, then you would automatically be taken into bankruptcy proceedings. And that prevented a lot of people to try to this. Because if something didn't go right, then you would just go bankrupt. So, and they have also tried to change that so you can go out of the restructuring process again and still try to survive in another way if that is possible. And there is some other minor changes that it is trying to perfect and the possibility for a positive outcome. Especially in Denmark, I don't know if you have it in your jurisdictions, we have an employees guarantee fund, where all employers contribute a certain amount on top of the wages. So when you have a bankruptcy, all wages will be covered also for a resignation period. So the employees will get their money paid. But if you have a transfer of business, a new owner of the business would normally enter into all the obligations toward the employees. And that could be quite difficult to have find a buyer who would take that risk to also take all the old liabilities from the employees. So that has been also suggested that a new buyer would only, in case of restructuring, take over employees from the day of restructuring and not from the past. So that will be paid by the guarantee fund instead. So this is some changes that will probably make it more easy to make a restructuring, but it hasn't been passed yet. So let's see if it will have any real value in the coming months months, I guess.
Well, it's been fascinating to hear how the land lies, not just in Ireland, but in Denmark and the UK. And it's clear that all governments and all businesses are faced with the same challenges. And like me, I expect, Peter and Monica, many of the conversations you're having with fellow professionals and clients is the question of, well, what does the future hold? And whilst it's very difficult for any of us to predict that at the moment, perhaps you might share with us your views on what the future holds for the retail sector in your respective countries. Perhaps, Peter, you can tell us what you think is on the cards in Denmark.
Yeah, I would be happy to do so. When I was appointed receiver in this bookshop, which were, like I said, in the end of April, I predicted that this was the first one, and now we will see the tsunami of bankruptcies coming in. But after the 8 packages, like I think you, Mark, were mentioning previously, this has been postponed. So a lot of the expected bankruptcies has not been showing up yet. But I think this is what I feel when I talk to clients and other people in the market, that the third and fourth quarter maybe already starting here in the second quarter, but from May and forth, I think it would be a very tough year. Of course, everything can change if they support or throw more money after the companies, because of course the government have an interest to maintain as much as possible. There need to be taxpayers to pay this bill at the end. But if nothing happens, and with what we have now, I think that everyone is at the limit. They were really cut down in March, April last year. They spent a lot of the surplus liquidity to survive that. And the last month, I think, has pushed a lot of companies very, very close to the limit of survival. So I think we will see it now, and I today I was called, it was 2 restaurants, not retail sector, but they are having the same problems like the retail sector. And I will get 2 bankruptcies tomorrow in the restaurant sector just because they have given up. They don't know when they can open again. They run out of cash, basically. So also to see in the future, what is it that these retail businesses will wake up to when everything is normal? I don't think we will see the same way to do business like before. I think we will see the trend that had started before COVID, that more sales went to online sales. I think this has been accelerated a lot due to the COVID-19. You have maybe progressed this with 5 years in what you have seen. If we had not had the COVID-19, we would be the same place in 5 years, I think anyway. But I think a lot of people, even people that normally would not have shopped online, for instance, elderly and which were not that familiar with this, they learned that it was actually easy and sometimes even cheaper. So I think a lot of the money have been changed from physical shops to online shops, and I think that will not change back. Of course, some of the sales will go back because there will also be room for shops where people can feel stuff and they need something now and not in 3 days. But I think we will see that the retail shops will be significantly lowered in numbers over the next year and 2, because people just have been starting to act differently. And at the moment, we haven't really seen that much employment in Denmark. So if that comes as well, then people stop spending money the same way, and that will accelerate even further this process. So I don't think the retail industry wake up to such a beautiful picture, even though that we can remove our masks and they can have open again. I think it will be, a tough work from now on to survive. So Monica, is UK the similar or different?
I think very similar in the case. I think retail and many other sectors as well are in for an incredibly difficult few months and years. And also corporate directors are tired. They've been battling for survival for the last year, and now we are starting to think, oh, it's the end of the pandemic, the end of restrictions, but actually it's just the very beginning for a lot of these companies to start thinking about how do they actually emerge from this crisis, further negotiations with lenders, further negotiations with landlords, and actually starting to think about a complete restructuring. So I think we will see in the next few months an increasing use of company voluntary arrangements in England, subject to the outcome of the New Look CVA challenge, which is going to be before the court shortly, and also the use of the restructuring plan and cramming down of dissenting creditors. It's been in the press this week that Virgin Active, which is the gym chain, is going to try and use the restructuring plan to cram down landlords for the first time. And that's been greeted, as one would expect, by outrage from the landlord community. But, if it does go ahead, it will be incredibly interesting. Saying that, though, I don't think there's all doom and gloom for retail. There are still investors interested in investing. We at Brown Rudnick, my partners at Brown Rudnick, recently completed the successful restructuring of Clark's, which is an iconic UK shoe store, employs 15,000 people worldwide. And that was a combination of CVA, which swapped most of the rents to turnover rents, which is something I think you're going to see more and more of, and new equity investment from a foreign investor. The thing is, shoes, though, is one of those things that are slightly different. People like to try on shoes, especially when they're buying shoes for their children. And so that is what retailers are going to be needing to think about very carefully over the coming few months, is what is it that their consumers want? I agree. I think we're going to see the continuing growth of online, but I don't think that is necessarily the magic bullet for all retailers. Look at the likes of Primark and Lidl, Aldi. They have no online presence, but at the same time, they're very they know what their consumers like, and they've come back stronger each time. Look, Primark, after lockdowns and restrictions have ended, Aldi and Lidl been in a different case because they've been able to remain open as essential food supply. I think the question is, what is retail going to look like in the future? And that's an interesting one. I don't think we're just going to go back to normal. John Lewis and Marks and Spencer have, I think, this week announced that they are both looking at their flagship stores on Oxford Street. I think the Marks and Spencer one is something like 6 stories, and they are going to repurpose those stores, cut down dramatically on the amount of space that is dedicated to selling things, and convert it to offices, leisure, other things to do for people to come, not just shop. And you're seeing that also with shopping centers. So during the last year, a number of underutilized shopping centers have converted some of their spaces to last mile logistics, dark kitchens for food takeaway, whilst other shopping centers are now looking at making the centers destinations. You don't just come there to buy something and you leave. You come for the day and you go out for something to eat and you buy something, maybe watch a film or go bowling and things like that. So retail is not going to look like it did when we entered this pandemic. It will be interesting to see what the new normal is. I think it will be a combination of online and some very interesting adaptations to what we already know. Mark, your views?
Thanks, Monica. Yeah, largely the same, and a lot of what you said there resonated. Particularly the turnover rents, actually, we've seen a move towards that in our own negotiations on behalf of landlords, tenants, I suppose rightly trying to link a rent to turnover, particularly when some of them aren't even trading at the minute. I suppose, yes, it's fair to say that the COVID has had a profound and, in my view, an indelible impact on retail. And picking up on some of the themes which we probably tuned into over the last number of years was the gradual move to online in any event. And really, COVID has only served to accelerate that to a very great extent. And for me, that's indelible. There isn't going to be, that genie, once it's out of the bottle, isn't going to be easily put back in. And so therefore, that creates a massive problem, effectively, for high street retailers. If you go into Dublin City today, for example, our busiest shopping street in the country is Grafton Street, and it would be practically empty today, which is almost impossible to believe. And many of the shops with international brands are effectively boarded up. And who would have thought that would ever be the situation? So obviously, there are massive challenges. There has also been opportunity for some sectors, as is the case in any crisis. So if you look at food, off-license, drink, medicine, pharmacy, all of those businesses have done very well. And in fact, as an interesting anecdote, at some stage during 2020, there was a flour shortage in Ireland. Nobody could get flour because everybody was baking at home. So who would have thought that would ever occur? So there's always opportunities in a crisis for some. But broadly speaking, retail is in the midst of a massive, is in the midst of a revolution, really. One of the other trends we've seen, and I don't know whether this would apply in Denmark or the UK, is a move towards suburban and local shopping because people are not commuting into the cities. So again, there's been an opportunity for those businesses to soak up some business that they wouldn't ordinarily get. And so there is, again, some opportunity. But it strikes me that even with the opportunity, a retail business that's going to survive now into the future has to adapt and must have some form of an online presence. And I think really any retail enterprise that doesn't have an online presence is going to find it hard to survive going into the future. Currently, it's not possible to say when we're going to be back in shops. Certainly, we can't say that in Ireland. And it may not be until in any meaningful sense, until the beginning of next year. So in an insolvency context, I don't actually believe that we'll see the full consequences of COVID and the attendant restrictions until such time as we are back trading and government supports are removed. It's hard to see an avalanche of insolvencies where there are government stimuli to keep people in jobs and keep businesses going. But as I say, once those are removed, really only the strongest will survive. And even those that do survive will be under significant pressure to adapt and effectively move their business into at least some degree to an online offering.
Well, Mark, I think that closes up very well what we have been discussing. So I think we should end it here.
Thank you very much. Okay, this is all from us now today. Thank you very much to Monica Lorenzo Perez from Brown Rudnick in the UK. Thank you, Monica, for your comments and inputs on this.
Thank you, Raphael. It's been a pleasure.
It was also very good to have you here, Peter Krarup, partner at Mazanti-Andersen, our member from Denmark. Thank you, Peter, for your comments.
Thank you.
Finally, Mark from BHSM in Ireland. Thank you very much for all your input.
Likewise, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Raphael.
And this is all from us today. Thank you very much.